background to the Berlin blockade goes back to World War II. Now, during World War II, there was an agreement on how Europe would be divided after the war, with areas of influence in the west and the east. One of these critical areas was Germany. The eastern half of Germany was to come under the influence of Russia. However, this didn't include the capital, Berlin, which is located in the middle of what was to become East Germany, and 100 miles from what will be the border of West Germany. The future of the city was to become quite complicated, as rather than being under control of a single entity, it was divided into separate zones, there being 4 major zones run by the Russians, the British, the French and the Americans, and 3 minor zones run by the Belgians, Luxembourg and Poland. Because the whole city was deep inside the eastern half of Germany, there was an agreement with the Russians that 3 air corridors would be set up to allow the free movement of goods and people to and from West Germany to the western controlled zones of Berlin. However, there was no agreement about road and rail access to Berlin. Initially, relatively free access was granted across eastern Germany, but this was to change. It was also hoped that once order had been restored to Germany, the war criminals being dealt with, the Nazi laws being revoked, etc., Germany could move from an Allied military administration towards a unified country once more. However, soon after the end of the war, cooperation between the Russians and the West broke down, with the Russian-controlled area becoming East Germany, and the northwestern area controlled by Britain, and the southwestern area controlled by America, merging to form a bi-zone, later become West Germany. With the Cold War now starting, this left Berlin in a rather isolated and vulnerable position. But Russia wasn't actually prepared to go to war over Berlin at this stage, so all parties concentrated on restoring order to what were their areas of control. Division of Germany into 2 opposing states was a virtual reality when the Russians and the West adopted a new currency for each area, having failed to come to an agreement over a new form of mark for both areas. In spring of 1948, the Russians decided to up the pressure on Berlin by insisting that all trucks and trains be searched by the Soviet authorities and no cargo could leave Berlin by rail without first getting permission. Sometimes these restrictions would just cause delays, other times movement was halted completely. The Americans at this stage, suspecting that this was a sign of things to come, stopped supplying military goods to West Berlin by train as they had been doing, and instead used their air freight to transport what they regarded as essential supplies. This little lift involved about 20 flights per day, meant at the start of the summer it stockpiled at least 18 days worth of food of all types, just in case it was needed. Now, on the 24th of June 1948, the Berlin blockade began in full, with the cutting off electricity and food supplies to the Allied area of Berlin, and the organising of Russian military exercises outside of Berlin in an attempt to scare the population. The Allies were in a bad situation militarily. There were only relatively few troops in Berlin, and these could have easily been defeated by the Russians nearby, and even the troops that were in West Germany, having drastically reduced due to the budget cuts, were heavily outnumbered by the opposing forces in the eastern half of Germany. So, an armed response was out of the question. Instead, it was attempted to airlift the supplies needed for 2 million people in Berlin. But could they supply enough food and other goods to keep the city running? The available planes could lift a few hundred tons per day, but it's estimated the city would need around about 5,000 tons per day to keep it supplied. The Russians, who during the war had seen Germany fail to airlift supplies to besieged troops, thought the Allies couldn't possibly manage to succeed. However, with the upgrading of various runways and drafting in of more aircraft, the Allies were able to bring in their supplies, despite harassment from the Soviet Air Force, which stopped just short of air-to-air combat. By the 12th of May 1949, when Stalin conceded defeat, the blockade had been surpassed by 2 million tons of food and other supplies. Most importantly, coal had been shipped into Berlin in the 318 days of the blockade. The Cold War remained cold in Europe, but Asia would soon become hot once more again.